Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to talk to you today about a paper that I was recently introduced to. I'm not going to elaborate on how or why this came across my desk, but some of these things do, and every so often you read something or I read something and it just immediately calls to my mind several other points. It's like one piece of information comes in and a dozen other little points just light up and these lines go out to those points and you think, this is all connected together now. I understand much more than I previously did, or I've made a bunch more connections that I previously didn't, and this is one of those occasions, and I'd like to walk you through it because I think this one's rather interesting. It ties together a bunch of little things regarding what you could call the loose umbrella of critical theories that the left is using these days. Critical theory is explicitly Marxist in its origins, by the way, and I'm going to be going through that a little bit throughout this talk. So I'm going to start you off at the beginning point, and then we'll go down the bizarre Marxist rabbit hole behind it, and then we'll bring it back to the topic, which is the paper that introduced me to all of this. I know it always sounds a little bit weird when we say, oh, this thing is Marxist, or that thing is Marxist, and people always think like, oh, just crazy bat conspiracy theorist with your tinfoil hat. Okay, sure, everything's just the ghost of Karl Marx coming back to destroy. No, it actually is, though. A lot of the ideas that we'll be discussing today are explicitly Marxist in origin. They are written by people who are openly and self-proclaimed Marxists, attending Marxist schools and writing for Marxist institutions. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is all quite out in the open. They are very transparent in their intellectual origins and their motivations. So let's get straight on into the topic, he said after wasting 2 minutes of your time on pointless preamble. So what began this little explosion of revelation, I suppose you could call it on my part, was a paper that came across my desk recently, The Pedagogy of Discomfort, Enhancing Reflectivity on Stereotypes and Bias. This was published in the British Journal of Social Work and is by Naden and Stark from 2017. Now, the first word, or the first, word that I'd like to highlight here is the concept of pedagogy. Now, pedagogy just means teaching, but that's really all it means. In its broadest sense, it is the method by which you teach or the method by which you learn. And it is, when you put it into a academic context, I suppose you could say, it can also include things like methods of teaching, methods of learning, and can even go so far as to include, and this is where all the critical theory stuff comes in, the concept of things like inclusivity and diversity for students, because as the critical theorists like to say, people have all this baggage regarding race and sex and all of this sort of stuff, and if you're not sensitive to this as a teacher, then you're impeding their ability to learn, and that is going to be based on some sort of predisposition of racism or sexism or something along those lines, because everything is like that for them. So in its broadest sense, pedagogy is just teaching, it's just learning, but in the pseudo-academic, semi-intellectual sense that a lot of these sorts of people like to use it, it has a bunch of baggage associated with it. And going into some of the baggage regarding pedagogy, and this is specifically talking about the DEI sort of stuff, the diversity and inclusion of students and whatnot, we get to critical pedagogy, which is something that, well, the pedagogy in this discomfort paper is being written about. So this is the part of the pedagogical understanding that they are relying on. Specifically critical pedagogy. And when it comes to critical pedagogy, I'm actually just going to read for you the first 3 paragraphs of the Wikipedia page regarding critical pedagogy, because when it comes to topics such as critical theory and Marxism, socialism, leftism more generally, Wikipedia is explicitly left-leaning in this, and you'll see why regarding the Marxism element. There's always been a bit of a furore on Wikipedia regarding things like cultural Marxism, and how up until about 2015, 2016, the page for cultural Marxism actually listed all of the academics who wrote about cultural Marxism. It was all very clearly laid out. It was a well-known, well-trodden area of discussion. And then when the non-Marxists, the non-socialists began looking at it, this Marxist way of doing things, their critical theories, and they said, well, this is cultural Marxism. This isn't good. Like, this is them attempting to use Marxism to understand things outside of economics, and this makes the assumption that Marx was an economist. He really wasn't, but that's a whole other thing for another time. So instead, they shifted all the cultural Marxism stuff out to things like critical theory, and in this case, critical pedagogy. They basically copy-pasted all that same stuff and put it into those articles, and then just declared that cultural Marxism is just a dangerous right-wing anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, as they are wont to do, because they have to hide what they're doing, because they don't want you to know. So the 3 paragraphs of critical pedagogy written by leftists on Wikipedia to describe their own ideas, we'll go through that now. Critical pedagogy is a philosophy of education and social movement that developed and applied concepts from critical theory, which is Marxism. You can even click on the critical theory link there. It will take you to the page that explains that. And the related traditions to the field of education and the study of culture. So that's just the first paragraph there. Critical theory, which is Marxism, is being used to look at the fields of education and to study culture. In other words, Marxism is being used to look at, to understand, to deconstruct, to critically analyze culture, and to build culture. But cultural Marxism is just a conspiracy theory. Okay, sure it is. Let's go on with the next couple of paragraphs here. It insists that issues of social justice and democracy are not distinct from acts of teaching and learning. The goal of critical pedagogy is emancipation from oppression through an awakening of the critical consciousness, based on the Portuguese term conscienciosia, my apologies for terrible pronunciation. When achieved, critical consciousness encourages individuals to effect change in the world through social critique and political action in order to self-actualize. Critical pedagogy was founded by the Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire, who many of you are probably familiar with, even if only by name, who prompted it through his 1968 book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It subsequently spread internationally, developing a particularly strong base in the United States, where proponents sought to develop meanings from using teaching to combat racism, sexism, and oppression. As it grew, it incorporated elements from fields like the human rights movement, civil rights movement, disability rights movement, indigenous rights movement, postmodern theory, feminist theory, post-colonial theory, and queer theory. So critical pedagogy here is literally just outlining to you exactly what is going on in Western schools. Specifically here, it's referencing more United States schools, but you see this a lot throughout Europe as well, and how and why all of this DEI critical X sort of topics and how and why these things are coming up now. It's because it's all related to this. So they are just using a critical theory lens to understand teaching. So if you look at critical theory, this thing, as I've said, is explicitly Marxist in origin. Again, if we just follow to the Wikipedia page here again, as written by leftists, critical theory is a school of thought practiced by the Frankfurt School. Theoreticians Herbert Marcuse, Theodore Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, and Max Horkheimer. These are all names that should be familiar to you, although some of those may be worth teasing out a little bit in their own time. So when we see all of this pedagogical stuff coming out of the academy, a lot of it is going to be tied to the explicitly Marxist in origin critical pedagogy, which is critical theory, which is Marxism. Now, you'll notice that a lot of this talks about things like confronting your own biases and learning through discomfort, which is what the Pedagogy of Discomfort paper is. There's a distinct line through a lot of this Marxist stuff that you have to confront these underlying biases that you don't even know that you have. And you don't know that you have them because all of these biases have been informed by all of the systems, all of the structures, all of the everything around you. This is very much the concept of the hegemon as laid out by Gramsci, which again might be something worth going over in its own time, but is somewhat outside the purview of what I would like to do here today. So the pedagogy of discomfort, going back to this paper, the pedagogy of discomfort, enhancing reflectivity on stereotypes and bias. Well, we'll go through the abstract and then I'll talk a little bit further about what is actually inside the paper. So the abstract of this peer-reviewed academic journal, again, there's these people like to always say, the leftoid Marxists, they always like to point at the peer-reviewed stuff, pulling their soy faces and pointing at them and going, "Ooh, look, it's from the academia, it's from the people with the pointy, funny, square hat things. That means it's beyond reproach, it must be correct." Of course, those of us who actually work in these fields and deal with these people frequently know there's a lot of pseudoscientific nonsense in there, and things like this fall very much into that category. But we'll go through the abstract and we will talk about why. So, this article describes, analyzes, and conceptualizes one pedagogical practice aimed at challenging social work students to reflect on the way they perceive the capital O other. Taking the online implicit association test at home and composing a non-graded reflection paper about the experience. Employing a qualitative paradigm, our analysis of 83 reflection papers enabled us to make 3 primary observations. First, that the experience caused students to leave their emotional comfort zone with regard to the discovery, identification, and acknowledgement of their own biases and racist stereotypical conceptions. Second, that the resulting experience of emotional discomfort led students to employ means of coping, such as rejection of the test's reliability, attempts to account for the test's results, and attempts to outsmart the test. And third, that the experience provided students with personal and professional insight regarding the nature of bias and stereotypes, and people's ability to change them. Our discussion proceeds in light of Bowler's 1999's Pedagogy of Discomfort, and considers both the importance of enhancing critical reflectivity and the challenges that arise from pedagogical practices that stimulate discomfort. So, first of all, this paper uses the implicit association test. The implicit association test is complete pseudoscience. It does not show racism, it does not show prejudice, it does not show bigotry in any form. What it does show is minute differences in reaction time between identifying faces of certain colors. Keep in mind these are black and white vignettes, which are only maybe an inch or so in diameter, both height-wise and width-wise. They're very tiny pictures, almost like they are designed intentionally to be incredibly difficult to identify. And then other parts of the test may pair those incredibly difficult to identify photographs with words, be they positive or negative, and then it measures your reaction time at sorting them left or right. Even the creators of the implicit association test have said that their test does not measure bias, be it racism or sexism or anything like that. And they have actually pleaded with academics to please stop referencing their test as though it proves something. It does not. Frequently what you find is that the differences found by the IAT may be as little as 0.00 something of a second difference between identification of white or black or good or bad or something along those lines. If you put differences like that into blinking, the process of you blinking your eye would not even be a quarter of the way closed on the close-open action that is the blink. That is the amount of difference that IATs will find, and yet apparently that is supposed to be proof that you just hate black people, or you just hate white people, or whatever ridiculous thing that it is attempting to demonstrate. Of course, when you actually look at any sort of sorting task when it comes to computers, you computerize any sort of sorting task, and a big part of the implicit association test is that the control set flips halfway through the test. So if you're sorting white faces left and then black faces to the right, you'll do that for a minute or two, and then the task will switch. So you'll be putting the white faces right and the black faces to the left. Now, what you have done there is effectively spent a couple of minutes creating a neurological pathway in the subject that you're looking at, similar to playing a video game. Like a lot of people, when you start playing a video game, if you've ever done this, I would imagine we're all sort of getting to an age and we're in a time where most people have played some sort of computer game. Even the really older people in my audience, of which there are legion, I will admit, you've probably played things like Pong or Pac-Man at least once just to even see what it was about, just to see what the technology was, whether it interested you or not. You probably know what it is. But you can apply this to any sort of task at all, whether it's something related to manual work, like you're doing some sort of like cutting up vegetables or something like that, or you're doing some sort of woodworking or anything like that. Or if you play an instrument, playing a musical instrument is another good, is actually probably a better example of this. But you can put it to anything like that. You create what is colloquially referred to as muscle memory, and muscle memory is basically a neurological shortcut. You strengthen neurological motions in your brain and in your hands, in your arms as well. You repeatedly use these pathways, they become stronger because your brain uses them over and over and over and over. And if you change the task that you're doing in some way, well, now you are effectively relearning. Now, the learning curve will frequently be quicker the second time around because it's not like you're learning the task initially for the first time. The first time is always the hardest time. The second, third, fourth time becomes a lot easier. And again, if you're someone who's ever played an instrument, say if you play something like the guitar, you know that because you've conditioned your fretting hand, the hand that is on the neck of the instrument, to do one particular task, and the other hand picks the strings, you know that if you pick up another stringed instrument, you will frequently find it a lot easier to transfer that skill over, but there will still be a learning curve to it. So, for instance, if you were to try learning the violin, the left hand, or whichever hand you've got on the neck, that's kind of doing a similar thing. It's just in a slightly different angle, a slightly different location. You only really then have to focus on what the other hand is doing, which is going to be the bow part of the motion rather than plucking strings. A similar thing happens in video games. If you play a video game for an extended period of time, your reflexes will improve. You'll effectively, in some cases, even be able to win the game blindfolded, depending on the rule set of the game and how complex it is, because you know what you have to do in relation to certain stimuli. You can listen to things like that and you can go from there. You create this muscular neurological feedback loop, and you've trod those neurological connections so frequently that they become effectively second nature. But imagine if you had the rule set changed on that. Well, that's where you start making mistakes, because you begin inherently using some of those previously learned traits, some of those previously learned patterns, but now they're doing something different, so you have to relearn. So there is going to be a learning curve involved in that, and the IAT may very well even just be measuring the learning curve, because you're sorting everything one way one time and then you suddenly put it going to the other way. Well, people are going to have those little half second of where you put it on one side and you go, oh no, I have to put it over there now. That could be all that the IAT is measuring. The IAT could even just be measuring the natural variance that people have when performing repetitive tasks. Human beings are not machines. They do not do single tasks or even a small number of tasks amazingly well, like absolutely perfectly every single time. There is always minute variance. Even people working on things like assembly lines have minute differences in speed and outcome for anything they're doing. So they can be doing these tasks hundreds or thousands of times a day. There will still be minute differences between each one of those actions, even though it's the same action. The IAT could just be finding that. So the fact that this paper is reliant on the IAT is that to me is enough to already discount articles or papers like this and just say, like, look, you're using this as if it proves something. It doesn't. Just stop. But of course they don't, because the IAT is a very useful weapon for people like this, because it allows them to do the next part of the paper, which is where they basically declare to their students, okay, we have found this bias in you. This means that you are a racist. You now need to write a paper reflecting on your racism and learn from your racism. And as they even say here, students deploy methods of coping. They employ means of coping, such as rejection of the test's reliability. They should reject the test's reliability. They absolutely should. Even the people who created the test reject the test's reliability. The people who created the test look at academics like this and plead with them, please stop using our test as though it proves this. And yet these academics continue using this test as though it proves something. So I quite enjoyed reading that, because this is basically just it's somewhat pernicious in a lot of ways. You've got these authors who are very obviously quite deep into this critical pedagogy way of doing things, and when you point out, look, there's a bunch of methodological problems with what you're doing, they just basically point at you and shout, cope, which I find hilarious, frankly, given given the online discourse and how the word cope has become somewhat a meme over the past few years. But yeah, you can see the academics there, they're already doing it as well. It's like, oh, you found a reason why this study that I've done or why this thing that I'm doing is wrong. You cope. You're just coping because you're wrong. Just didn't know I'm not the problem, you're the problem. Stop trying to cope so hard, loser. There's just a level of amusement in that. But the pernicious part of this paper is that they're using this pseudoscience to justify this pedagogy of discomfort. So they've declared that you're just coping because the IAT is actually wrong, but the fact that you know it's wrong is just you coping because you can't accept that you've been caught out as the racist bigot that you really truly are underneath all the levels of cope, all the levels of hiding. No, you're actually secretly a bigot, and we have proof because you reacted to something in a quarter of the time that it takes for you to blink. That proves you hate black people. And now you must repent. You must go through the pedagogy of discomfort. You must learn from your discomfort. You must face your discomfort, and you must become a better person as a result of facing your discomfort. You need to go through the struggle session. And that is what the pedagogy of discomfort is. That is what this paper is encouraging in people. This is what these so-called teachers are encouraging in their students. It is a struggle session. There is no other way of looking at it. And to give you an idea of how pseudoscientific this is, because of course we talk about the pedagogy of discomfort here, we can't not address Bowler's 1999 work, Pedagogy of Discomfort. We can't not address what Bowler has written on this topic, because it's quite important. And it's actually somewhat fortuitous. I suppose I can reveal this is the connection and how and why this paper came to be known to me. It's because Megan Bowler is actually an author who has written on affective education, so affect, which is just the expression of emotion, and obviously that comes up in sociobiology, which is something which I deal with on a fairly regular basis. We deal with the concept of affect and affect theory and how people express emotions and express ideas and communicate with each other. And so it was a name that was somewhat vaguely known to me. It was like stored away in the back of my mind somewhere. And so I read that. I was like, Bowler. It's like, I vaguely, dimly remember that name from somewhere. And this is, of course, why. So if you go through Bowler's history, she wrote a book called Feeling Power. And Feeling Power is, well, there is a short summary of the book, which I will read for you, and you'll understand exactly where they're coming from with this. So Megan Bowler combines cultural history with ethical and multicultural analysis to explore how emotions have been disciplined, suppressed, or ignored at all levels of education and educational theory. Feeling Power begins by charting the philosophies and practices developed over the last century to control social conflicts arising from gender, class, and race. The book traces the development of progressive pedagogies from civil rights and women's liberation movements to the author's recent studies of emotional intelligence and emotional literacy. She concludes by outlining a pedagogy of discomfort that examines the empathy, fear, and anger to negotiate ethics and differences, drawing on the formulation of emotion as knowledge within feminist, psychobiological, and post-structuralist theories. Bowler develops a unique theory of emotion missing from contemporary educational discourses. So this is straight up again critical theory, this is critical pedagogies, this is the Marxist way of understanding things. It's the link, I think, is pretty clear based on what we've covered over the last 20-something minutes of this. Specifically, the focus on gender, class, and race as these intersecting identities that cause all of these problems, and therefore there will inevitably be the requirement that these things become abolished. Because, of course, as they mention in this summary here, how emotions have been disciplined, suppressed, and ignored at levels of education. Because you see, teachers, they have to care about how their students feel. They have to care about how all of these emotions are being displayed, or not, as the case may be, and they have to allow their students to just express their emotions. You have to be emotionally incontinent everywhere, all the time, always emoting. And as soon as we start peeling back those layers and you realize what this is saying, that explains so much of how the modern progressive left behaves, doesn't it? You see, if you're disciplining, suppressing, and ignoring your emotions, well, you can't do that because that's the toxic masculinity, that's the patriarchy, that's all of this stuff, and so we have to burn it all down, we have to destroy it all. Effectively, what is part of a fundament of Western civilization, the idea that there are times and places for your emotions to be revealed. It is not always there, all the time, always emoting. There is a time to compartmentalize and deal with what you're feeling later in an appropriate time and an appropriate space. In fact, pretty much every culture has some sort of concept of that, but these people, these critical theorists, these Marxists, they're not interested in actually understanding cultures, in actually understanding how these things work. They just want to destroy Western civilization because that is their goal, because they are Marxists. Also, throughout this summary, you'll notice the reference to emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence doesn't exist, by the way. Emotional intelligence was one of these pseudoscientific constructs created by people who don't like the concept of IQ. And so they started coming up with all of these other forms of intelligence. They started coming up with things like emotional intelligence, musical intelligence, social intelligence, because they just didn't like the fact that IQ is the objectively best indicator of life success. It's the objectively best one that we've found thus far. And unfortunately, because certain groups do better on IQ tests than other ones, that means that IQ tests are racist and need to be abolished. We definitely need to prove why they are completely wrong, even though they're not. If you want to throw out IQ, you basically have to throw out everything that we know about psychology, because the models that we've come up with of measuring intelligence, and you could also put into that the 5-factor model as well, the methods by which we've come up with these two instruments, which are the best that we have in psychology. If you destroy those, you basically destroy most of the rest of the field of psychology, because the instruments that were used to develop those two methods of measuring these things, those kind of informed a bunch of other models because they work. So negative points to Bowler for, first of all, being a Marxist, and secondly, relying on the pseudoscience of emotional intelligence. And also minus points for emotion as knowledge. Emotion is not a form of knowledge, but this is another one of these critical Marxist ways of doing things. When you go through this, when you acquire the knowledge of the Marxism, you go through this process that they like to call becoming. I'm sure you've encountered this throughout several of the papers that we've read on this channel just over the years. You keep seeing this concept of becoming, the idea that you have an experience or you gain a piece of knowledge, you go through this process of becoming, and you become a different person with this knowledge on the other side. Now, this is actually there's no other way of describing it. There is a religious element to this. It's sort of a weird offshoot of Gnosticism and the concept of illumination, the concept of enlightenment. You go through a process of becoming, and in doing so, you become the enlightened. You become above all of the other people. You are, to use the original terminology, you were the psychic, the middle of the three tiers of people. You were the psychic, the person who is capable of becoming enlightened. You went through this process of enlightenment, you went through your becoming, and you became a pneumatic, the highest tier of human that there is, the fully actualized person with the spirit, the breath, the mind, the enlightenment, all of these other things that they do. And as a result of this, you get to look down on all of the people who haven't gone through the process of becoming, they haven't gone through the enlightenment. They call them the somatics or the helix. They're two words for the same thing, which is the lowest tier of people. Now, according to these people, that's the tier that people like me and you are on, because we reject all of this insanity that they push out. They would consider us to either be the filthy helix or possibly psychics who just refuse to accept the acknowledgement, refuse to accept the enlightenment. But let's be honest, they think that you're the peasant. They think that you are the lowest of the low. You're incapable of enlightenment. And you actually see this quite a lot in how they talk about people outside of their circles, outside of their cliques. They talk about either you being willfully ignorant or, more often than not, incapable of understanding. They always like to refer to people like us as being simply too stupid to understand all of these big brain concepts that they're bandying around. We simply completely lack the intellectual capacity to grasp such big brain thinking thoughts that they have, even though the big brain thinking thoughts that they're having are actually quite simplistic in a lot of ways. All you have to do is just read them. As soon as you understand the lexicon that they use, it all becomes pretty clear, because it's not actually as complicated as they like to think that it is. But touching on the religious origins of critical theory, the religious origins of intersectionality, and the religious origins of feminism, that's something for another time. I am hypothetically working on a video about it, but whether I actually get around to making it, who even knows? I may just cut it up into bite-sized pieces and publish it out in a series of shorter videos. But I'm kind of concerned that they may end up somewhat mismatched and get lost throughout the noise, and I'll be relying on occasionally in those videos pointing and saying, go watch this thing, go watch that thing, go watch this thing over here, and that will explain all of it. But this is the problem. Ultimately, when we deal with a lot of this stuff, we're attempting to condense potentially 1,000-odd years of history that combines Eastern and Western mysticism into one topic. You can't do that in a timely manner, I'm afraid. It is a long and winding road, and you have to walk every single painful step of it. Although I will say it is worth it in the end, because you understand all of this stuff. You understand where it all comes from, why they say what they say, and you realize how not only wrong it is, but how frequently insane it is. But the thing that makes it even worse is that you can mention this to a lot of the critical theorists, the intersectionalists, the people who believe all of this stuff, and they'll just declare that you're a crazy conspiracy theorist because they don't actually know that this is the intellectual origin, that this is the tradition of the ideas that they are espousing, because they haven't actually read it. They've only read the latest I was about to say they've only read the latest incantations of this thing as opposed to the latest incarnations, but actually that slip of the tongue is completely accurate. They have only actually read the latest incantations of it. They've only read the latest version of their religion. They haven't actually read the origin point of it, in a similar way that most Christians have never actually sat down and read the Bible. But that's it. We're wandering off into the weeds now, and my brain is squirreling around all of these topics as it is wont to do. I've covered what I wanted to cover, and hopefully that was something of interest to you. So the pedagogy of discomfort, you may find that this is going to come up a few times when you deal with these people. They might not actually use the term pedagogy of discomfort, but you will find them using euphemisms for it. You'll find them talking about confronting your bias, confronting your racism, how you need to stop coping, how you need to stop being so fragile. That's another word they like to use. You just need to face up to it because they are the enlightened person who definitely knows what's going on, and you are just the unenlightened person. You haven't gone through your becoming, so you don't know. You lack the illumination, you don't actually understand what's going on, whereas they do, because they are the critical theorists. They are the person who has been put on this earth to criticize all of the things. They are the person, they don't actually build things, they just exist to criticize. They just exist to point at everything in society and say that it's wrong, because that is all that they do. and they exist just to point out how and why everything is wrong on the forever march to the far left of history, which is how these people perceive the world, that history has an endpoint, and it is always the far left progressive insanity that is the endpoint that they are moving towards. And with that in mind, you frequently find that the ends end up justifying the means for a lot of these people, but that is another topic for another time. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's been a little bit long and a little bit windy, but I found this interesting, and I hope you did as well.